Skyrish Nation, I'm your co-host, Brett. Welcome to the show with my colleague here, Mike. Notre Dame throttles Army, but most importantly, we are here today to talk about Notre Dame and USC.
Ogunbowale for the win! Good!
And no, folks, we are not a football school. I am talking about Neil Ivey, Olivia Miles, Hidalgo, Sonia Citron, absolutely dominating win over number 3 USC in women's basketball. Mike, I don't think you got to watch it. I watched it wire to wire. That was just awesome. And it looks like we got a Final Four team.
Yeah, I was tied up, but I was monitoring the score. I was, following what was happening in the game. But yeah, I mean, just an incredible day for Notre Dame sports. Whether it's the football team, women's basketball, just everything that was happening across the college football landscape. I think if you're a fan of Notre Dame athletics as a whole, that's honestly about as good as it gets.
That was incredible. And I mean, just like in LA, every big celebrity there. I think we've got 2 All-Americans, maybe 3, all playing guard. Like it's fun stuff. But I get it. We're a football podcast. We're here to talk about Army. We're here to preview USC. I'm really excited. We're going to do a third segment that, Mike, I haven't even told you the name yet. I'll explain it later, but it's all Anne's fault segment, and my wife.
Okay.
Anne. I will explain that later. I didn't include it in the preview notes. My bad. But before we get into those 3 segments today, Mike, you are also going to the other Notre Dame USC matchup next week. Tell me about your Thanksgiving plans. I'm pumped for you and really a big opportunity to watch ND in person and cement a place in the 2024 college football playoff.
Definitely. So my entire family's flying out for Thanksgiving. So obviously we're hosting Thanksgiving, which that's going to be a big endeavor. We got to cook all the
first
cook all
time
the meals.
hoster.
Technically, I hosted in 2016, but I think that's overstating it a little bit. Basically, we put in an order at Whole Foods for all like pre-made food, and you just had to heat it up essentially. So technically, I did provide a turkey and mashed potatoes and all that stuff in 2016, but it wasn't homemade. And then we did actually go to the USC game in 2016. Although the 2016 season, as we've talked about 1,000 times on this podcast,
not great.
was not great. And that game was cold and rainy.
Terrible.
And just a blowout. So not fun. That was not a good experience. But this time around, so my family's coming in. They're staying at my house. And we're doing the full treatment here. We're preparing everything from scratch. We got the turkey. We're going to have the turkey ready to go. So I'm excited to do a real hosting. This is really my first real hosting for Thanksgiving. So I'm excited about that. And then on top of that, my family, we're all Notre Dame fans. I have some friends who are going to be around too. So we're going to be hosting a tailgate with another one of my buddies. So the game, unfortunately for us, it's a little bit earlier. We were hoping it would get that primetime slot. So local time kickoff is 12:30. So not as much time as we would like to tailgate, but we're going to get there early. We have a tailgate spot. I tried finding Malort. I was unable to find Malort. I was trying to bring a little taste to Chicago. But we're going to have a lot of good options, a lot of good food, a lot of good drinks. And then most importantly, hopefully we're going to be able to see Notre Dame look strong to close the year and secure their spot for presumably a home playoff game. And we can get into that more, but Notre Dame's, they've already been sending out information about buying tickets for home playoff games. So they're getting ahead of this. And I mean, Brett and I have been doing a little like temperature check with a few people, and it seems like a lot of people that we just know personally are open to the possibility of attending a home playoff game in late December in South Bend.
So I didn't put this together, and we've been texting all week. I am also hosting Thanksgiving for the very first time ever. My wife Anne's family's coming down. Tom, Betsy, Taylor, Mary Beth, the kids. So I know a lot of y'all listen to the show. If you're listening, excited to have you descend on Atlanta. It's easy for me. This is basically a collection of really, really good Southern cooks coming to my house. So I have nothing to do on the food front other than be taste tester. I'm sure I'll help out on all the others. And keep the kids busy, but really looking forward to family time and Thanksgiving. And I also got to say, yeah, I get it. We're not supposed to jinx things, but look, we're a data podcast, so we can't believe in superstitions. We might be a little stitious, but we can't be superstitious. I've been all about manifesting what I want in life, not being superstitious about jinxing things that I hope, don't come to pass. So I've manifested this. My buddy Pat, also listener to the show, got a new home in South Bend about 6 months ago now. And I think the day they closed on the house and told us, hey guys, we're moving to South Bend, I texted him and said, that's awesome. Will there be furniture by December 20th? Because I would like a place on your bed when Notre Dame hosts a football playoff game. So I've been manifesting this for 6 months. I'm ready to go to South Bend. I've got my bed all ready to go in Pat's basement. So You've got USC covered. I will for sure be at a first round playoff game. For sure, if it's at home, it looks like a lot of the other places, even if we, slip it all, could be down in SEC country, which would be hopefully drivable from Atlanta. So enough on Mike and my November travel schedules and December travel schedules. Our listeners are here to talk about football. Let's get into this Army game. 49-14. Total blowout. Another pass of the eye test. A fourth top 25 win. I will caveat, A&M losing, Louisville kind of struggling. I think only one of those wins is going to be a currently ranked top 25 team at this point, but still a flashy stat. Mike, where do we start? I feel like it's got to be defense. That's the tradition at this point. What stood out to you on the defensive side of the ball?
So just yardage, just start with that. 233 yards allowed. And that's honestly overstating, I think, how productive they were. So they only had 158 yards before that garbage time touchdown in the fourth quarter. And I think my big takeaway when I was looking at the advanced stats here was that it's just any way you wanted to slice the data, it just showed thorough domination. I'm starting with the defense, but honestly, that goes for the offense too. So we mentioned last week in our preview of Army how effective Army and their option offense was at generating a high success rate. So they were number one in the country. That's not opponent adjusted, so they were going against weaker competition. But still, to be number one in the entire country in success rate, that's impressive no matter who you're playing. And they were on average, they were generating a success rate of 56%. So it's a bit of, as we mentioned, a bit of give and take. If you run an option, you're gonna have a higher success rate. You're not gonna have as many explosive plays. You're not gonna give the defense as much of an opportunity to generate havoc plays, but you generally keep chugging along downfield, bit by bit. So for us, even though their entire offense was designed to generate a high success rate, not only did we slow them down, not only did we take them off their average, we actually held them to a 31% success rate. So that's not even just a drop off to like an average level of success rate. That's actually well below average. 31%, especially for the number one team in the country, that is absolutely horrible. So our defense was just not giving them anything. And as I mentioned, the option limits havoc. So you don't get a whole lot of opportunities to sack them, tackle for loss. They don't throw the ball as much, so you're not going to be intercepting it. But for the year, they were only allowing 6% havoc. And in this game, we generated 20% havoc. Now, that's not, I would say, for like an average matchup that's not an option team, that's not eye-popping number, but that's a good number. Against an option team, 20%, that's exceptional. So we were giving them no opportunities to move the ball downfield. They weren't picking up successful play after successful play. We were generating a lot of havoc. And then they also weren't generating any explosiveness either. So pretty much, as I said, any way you want to slice it, we weren't really giving them anything. We were giving them absolutely no ground at all on offense. And it was exactly what you saw. It was a complete and thorough dismantling.
I thought the only other stat to call out that I just think is phenomenal is tackling. Notre Dame's again a top 10 tackling team in the country. Defenses that are elite have a missed tackle rate of around 10%. So, 10% of the time they're trying to make a tackle, they whiff. It happens. It's football. Our missed tackle rate in this game was 5%. I think that's really hard against the triple option when there's so much misdirection, there's so many gadgets, there's so many players. It just feels like you're always a step slow trying to catch up to what the option's doing. And it was led by our linebackers. Osbury and Kaiser led the team with 7 tackles. Between those two guys, 0 missed tackles from our 2 linebackers that were on the field the most in this game. Just awesome stuff tackling that just it makes it hard for the triple option. Every time you're getting your hands on them, you're getting them to the ground. On offense, nearly a perfect game. The only times we didn't score, we got stopped at the 1-yard line on 4th down and had 2 missed field goals. All other 7 drives ended in a touchdown. And those advanced metrics, look, we highlighted how gaudy they looked on the defense. This is a game where they looked just as gaudy on offense. We only gave up a 9% havoc rate. We had a 58% success rate. So we had that exact consistency of moving the ball and staying on schedule that a triple option team would want. But then we poured on top of that just massive chunk plays after chunk play after chunk play. That was highlighted with 68-yard and 58-yard touchdowns by Love and Williams, respectfully, out of the backfield. But 11 different guys had a gain of 10 yards or more. I'm not sure I've actually seen that. 11 different players touched the ball in a Notre Dame football uniform and picked up 10 yards or more. Jeremiah Love had 4 runs over 10 yards. Jadarian Price had 3 runs over 10 yards. So amazing push by the offensive line. We had 6.9 yards before contact. That was helped by the Love and Williams touchdowns. I think of both of those, I don't think they were touched, but
Yep.
3.7 line yards. That's the, kind of advanced stat describing how much push is an offensive line generating, almost a full 4 yards per run. I thought similar to the defense, we've had a hard time highlighting playmakers on defense this year because there's just so many and there's so much depth being used that you don't see a lot of guys with 10 tackle games because we're just rotating players so much. This was a lot like that. Jeremiah Love headlines at 7 carries for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns. He only had 7 carries. So I think there were just so many guys getting involved. Jordan Faison, I thought Jaden Thomas graded out really well, especially again blocking. He's such a physical wide receiver. Bo Collins, Mitch Evans, Chris Mitchell, just a lot of different pieces getting involved. It feels like we still don't have a bona fide number one wide receiver. I think Mike Denbrock in this offensive unit, though, is starting to prove me wrong. In the offseason, I kind of talked about how, we don't have a number one wide receiver, but do we have a number two? Yeah, it feels like we're starting to have a bunch of number two wide receivers that can play this offense with more depth than maybe a bona fide star. Mike, I'm curious your thoughts on Riley Leonard. I think this might have been his best game of the year. 91% adjusted completion. Wasn't great running it, but I thought played a very, very good passing game in this one. Highly efficient. How do you grade out Riley Leonard in this one?
Yeah, I think you said so. It was a quiet day running the ball, but I thought he looked great in the passing game. I thought we didn't have to throw the ball a bunch, but he looked very comfortable when we did. He just continues to look more and more comfortable in our offense. And Brett, you asked if this. I mean, you mentioned that maybe this was his best game yet. This is a theme that we've had the last 3-4 games. I feel like we keep saying, "Oh, was this Riley Leonard's best performance?" So he's been stringing together a number of these. So we're seeing more and more consistency. We're seeing a guy who's really at this point. To me, he's a good quarterback. At the beginning of the year, he looked uncomfortable in the offense. He didn't always, he seemed like a bit tentative to air the ball deeper downfield. He had a solid average depth of target this game. I think we're seeing. We mentioned the rust coming off a few weeks ago. I think the rust is off, and now he's finally kind of hitting that next level in the offense. He's hitting that those upper level math classes, so to speak. He's really like getting into the nitty gritty. So, and I mean, I think last week we talked about how he was not performing as well under pressure, although he actually did pretty well against UVA. This game was not. It didn't really give us any data for that. He was only under pressure 3 times. And I mean, part of that's a credit to our offensive line. I think you're talking about Riley Leonard having his best game of the year. I think this was probably our offensive line's best game of the year.
Mm-hmm.
But they were so good. I mean, Riley Leonard was barely under pressure 3 times. He was 1 for 2 for a 6-yard touchdown, scrambled 1 time. So not really enough data there to really say. I think one other stat I want to mention with him is that he had a 91% adjusted completion percentage if you account for throwaways. So just continuing to look more and more accurate. I think there was really only one play that I can point to where he had like a throw where he missed, where he just like clearly missed. So I think that just tells you that I think now we actually have a weapon at the quarterback position. And you have that. You have our offensive line seeming to gel finally. And then you have our running backs have been great all year. Our wide receivers, as you mentioned, it seemed like we had a bunch of number 4 receivers early in the year. Now it seems like maybe we have a bunch of number 2s. Don't have a number 1, but it seems like all this is coming together at the right time. I mean, the latest SP Plus data has our offense as number 9 right now. So the way we're performing tells us that we have potentially a top 10 offense. And I think we're still improving. I think we're still we still have further to go on some of these positions. I think our offensive line, I think they could still continue to improve. Certainly. I think Riley Leonard, it seems like he's getting better almost every game. So yeah, I mean, I think again, he didn't have to do a ton, but for what he was asked to do, he performed exceptionally well.
This was his 3rd highest Pro Football Focus grade as a passer on the season. His 4 highest Pro Football Focus grades as a passer are the last 4 games. I think that's a really exciting sign for Notre Dame. I know we've spent a lot of time trying to break down different things in his game, especially around, is his passing under pressure, maybe an Achilles heel. Well, part of that could just be our offensive line's gelling and getting more experience, and he's under pressure less, as you rightfully called out in this game. It's interesting is one of his best games, at least according to the grading, was actually Florida State, and his stats look pretty pedestrian because we had a ton of drops in that game. This was our first game since Purdue where we didn't have a drop pass. That really helps out a quarterback, right? And so I think there's a lot of things coming together at the right time for this offense. And I get it. Army doesn't have a lot of 4-stars out there, but we talked about this in the preview. This is a top 30, top 40 defense in the advanced metrics. And we just made them look like they were on a totally different sport. There's just absolutely no way to say anything other than an amazing offensive performance for this football team. Jeremiah Love, I think, gets a lot of the headlines with 7 carries for 130 yards. Okay, you get the highlight reel. I think Riley Leonard was right there with him as a real star of this game and starting to get there. Let's talk field goals. I'm going to ask you a question at the end. I'll give a little data to set it up, but I want to know where the panic meter is. And, yes, punt blocks are fun. So I think overall special teams is still doing okay. But it's really a tale of two cities where Mitch Jeter comes in as a very highly touted transfer out of South Carolina. He's clearly not 100%. He's been dealing with a groin injury. It kept him out of several weeks. The coaching staff has said he's still not fully healthy, but this is a little bit, it's the best we got. Eric Goins was 0 for 1 on extra points. Yoakum has made just 40% of his kicks, and that percentage is actually worse on field goals less than 40 yards. Our long distance specialist, Diomide, he missed his only attempt and badly. And yeah, Jeter's not doing much better. He's 6 for 11, so 54% on the year. As a team, we're making less than 50% of our kicks, and somehow Jeter's the best guy we got, and he's clearly playing hurt. I'm worried, are we going to give him the yips by continuing to run him out there? Are we better off just waiting till he's fully healthy to not lose confidence? How should we think about panic meter right now?
I think it's right to be concerned for sure. I mean, we still have to win a game against USC. So I think assuming we beat USC, which you can't just assume that obviously, but if we do, I think then we get a month off and hopefully he gets back to full health. We know that when he's fully healthy, if he doesn't have the yips, we know he can be an effective kicker. He made 92% of his kicks at South Carolina. So clearly this is a guy who, when he's healthy and feeling good, he makes his kicks at a pretty good clip. But given that he's not healthy yet, and then when we've attempted to kind of work him in, he's looked shaky to say the least. I'd say that gives me a 7 out of 10 because in terms of the panic meter, because I'm not 100% sure that we're ever going to get to the point this season where we have a serviceable kicker. I think you mentioned, Brett, the point that we keep bringing him out, and yeah, he doesn't look ready. I mean, I think even from this game, the field goals that he did kick, he seemed pretty tentative. He didn't seem to approach these kicks, like someone who's fully healthy. It seemed like he was kind of approaching it almost from a mindset of, all right, I'm not going to kick this as hard as I can. I'm going to kick it about as much as I need to make it. And, they also weren't very accurate either. So I don't know. I think there's definitely a right to be concerned. I mean, I'm certainly concerned, but the reason this isn't a 10 is because we know when he's healthy, he can be good. We just got to hope that he also, in addition to just getting physically healthy, he also is able to get mentally, in the best shape possible too.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's impossible not to think that we lost to NIU by 2 and had 2 block kicks in that game. This has already cost Notre Dame dearly on the season. I get it. There were 100 other things wrong in that game, and kicking, I don't even know if it makes my top 5, but it certainly could have been a difference maker and wasn't. And now you just got to hold your breath. Maybe it gets us more aggressive on 4th down. If we just become a go for it on all 4th downs, I don't mind that either. So there's definitely more ways, I think, in the current game to plan around kicking issues. But that was another ugly thing here in this Army game that, you hope with a month to get healthy, that makes a difference. But right now, definitely a problem for Notre Dame football fans if we're in a tight game and really need to come through with 3 points. Other than that, Notre Dame dominating win in a top 25 matchup. One more to go. Mike, USC, we've talked about it in the opener to the show. You're going to be there in person. I was thinking back prepping for this game. I remember when we covered Lincoln Riley before the 22 season thinking this is awesome for college football. Like Notre Dame, Marcus Freeman, Riley, and Lincoln Riley at USC, like massive rivals. Like this could be the coaching matchup for decades. And it's just not worked out for Lincoln Riley. 7-5 last year in the regular season. He's 6-5 this year. He had Caleb Williams as a Heisman Trophy winner a year ago and just couldn't get wins on the board. And, this year they win the opener against LSU. USC fans are starting to think playoffs, and it just hasn't come together. But the data tells a different story. Like, is this really a 6-5 team that, is average, or is that really kind of a misleading narrative to just look at the record?
If you look at the advanced stats, it would tell you that certainly is misleading. So I'll just spit out what some of these games that they've lost, what the results were. So they lost to Michigan by 3 on the road, Minnesota by 7. Minnesota's they're not a top like 10 team, but they're a good team that if you don't show up to, they could definitely beat you. Top 5 Penn State team at home. They lost by 3. An inexplicable 1-point loss to Maryland, so that one's not good. And then a 5-point loss to Washington. So for me, it's very reminiscent of Notre Dame in 2016, where if you just have a handful of plays go a different way, your perception of the season changes dramatically. So whereas USC is a massive disappointment this year, 4 or 5 plays go the other way, you could be talking about a team that is actually contending for a playoff spot. So, I mean, they have 0 losses by more than 7 points. And in fact, in all 5 losses, they had a second half lead. And in 4 of those 5, they actually had a fourth quarter lead. So that just tells you that they've been competitive in all these games. And that's reflected in the advanced stats. So they're number 23 in SP+. So not a playoff contender per the advanced stats, obviously. But certainly better than what you'd expect from a team that's 6-5 and has some of these losses. So while the record is very disappointing, this is a team that on any given day, they can be competitive and they can knock off a very good team.
Absolutely. And it starts with talent. They're number 15 in the 24/7 talent composite. For context, Notre Dame is number 9. This USC squad has 40 4 and 5 stars on their roster, 40. So substantially every guy going on that field on both sides of the ball will be a 4 or 5 star for Lincoln Riley. The only other team that Notre Dame's played this year that has more 4 and 5 stars, that's higher in the talent composite, Texas A&M. So this is really the second time all year where Notre Dame's gone up with another one of those truly good rosters from a talent perspective. And I think it shows in USC's ability to stay competitive in these games. Mike, you're our local Los Angeles guy here. So I'm going to lean on you, I think, for really the biggest narrative starting on the offense. They benched Miller Moss. And I think by all accounts, he was on pace for over 3,000 yards, was completing 64% of his passes, had 18 touchdowns through 9 games. Like, why did he get benched? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, so on paper, some of these stats you mentioned, they look really good. But some context that's important here is that there was a stretch where they lost 4 or 5 games, and Moss's play was a big part of that. He regressed. So while he put up some big stats earlier in the year, if you look at the later stretch of that 4 or 5, that 5-game stretch that I mentioned, he had 7 interceptions. And then actually in the last game against Washington, he had 3. So I think USC, they saw a player who was seemingly getting worse as the year went on, and someone who is not someone who's going to be a quarterback there for years and years to come. They brought in a transfer quarterback from UNLV who they think highly of and who has more eligibility, and someone that you don't think that you'll have a big drop off with. It makes sense to turn the page, and that's exactly what they did. So he's played 3 games now, and the stats so far are similar passing: 4 touchdowns to 1 interception. Obviously, there's not like a regression trend that you were seeing with Miller Moss. He's completed about 64% of his passes. I think one big thing with him is that he is a dual threat. So Miller Moss, not a dual threat QB. It's not like he's a statue, but he's certainly not someone who's a dynamic threat in the run game. Jaden Maeva is he's, like I said, he's someone who's very mobile. He tends to use his mobility to buy time, although he will rip off some scrambles here and there. And he has a strong arm. I was watching the game yesterday against UCLA, and he's not perfectly consistent yet, but he will like complete some throws that are certainly NFL throws on the run, across the field, and he spins it well. So he's someone who certainly is a high potential prospect. I think he's 6'4", so he's got, I think, decent. He's got decent height. He has certain tools that you definitely would like to have as an NFL prospect. So someone who's maybe not as experienced, certainly some other USC quarterbacks as we've seen. He's definitely not Caleb Williams. Definitely a big drop off from Caleb Williams. But this is someone who has a lot of physical tools, and so far he's played. Look, he hasn't lit the world on fire, but he's played well. You'll see they use play action a lot, 33% of dropbacks. That's something that Notre Dame at times should be doing more of. It's something in a dynamic passing offense that you need to utilize. Seems like USC is comfortable doing that, and he's effective in it. 3 of his 4 touchdown passes are on play action. So he's a guy that you definitely you need to be able to, certainly when the running play action, you have to be able to try to limit him as much as possible.
And it seems like this is a very different makeup of skill position players for Lincoln Riley and USC. I think we're so used to Drake London, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jordan Addison. Like every year, it's like, okay, that's the guy that's going to be in the first round of the NFL draft playing wide receiver for USC. That's not the case this year. They've got 7 different receivers with 20 or more catches. 6 different receivers have gone over 300 yards receiving. For context, Notre Dame only has 2 guys who have eclipsed the 300-yard receiving mark. They've got 6, but they don't have a guy that's, on pace anywhere close to 1,000 yards receiving. I think their leading receiver is a smidge over 500 yards. So this is very much a balanced attack, a lot of guys rotating in and out. The one place where it is a heavy workload is at running back. Woody Marks, he's already totaled over 1,000 yards on the season and 9 touchdowns, but more of a bruiser and not necessarily an elusive player. Just to put some stats behind that, he has 192 carries on the year and has forced 31 missed tackles, which sounds great. He's forcing about 3 missed tackles a game. For context, Jeremiah Love has almost twice as many, 53 missed tackles forced on almost half, not quite, about 40% fewer carries. Riley Leonard has 33 forced missed tackles on just about half as many carries. So our quarterback on half as many carries has forced on half as many carries has forced just as many missed tackles as Woody Marks. So especially going up against a very elite tackling Notre Dame team that feels like a good matchup for us. This is not a guy with breakaway speed. This is not a guy that's really known for kind of being that elusive, like, don't want to call this back, but Reggie Bush type player. That's just not who they got there. But he's getting a ton of carries and he's bruising them out at 4 or 5 yards a carry. And he's over 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns. And then a very, very balanced passing attack. I like that matchup for Notre Dame, especially in the post-Ben Morrison era. I think if you had an elite number 1 wideout wide receiver, I felt like, great, line up Ben Morrison and let's go to work. I'll take my guy over your guy. Now that we don't have Ben Morrison, as great as Christian Gray has played, as great as Leonard Moore has played, I think our strength is in numbers on defense with Hurd and Clark and Watts and Leonard Moore and Christian Gray. I think our depth in the secondary matches up very, very well against what Lincoln Riley is going to try to do. And that's throw 4 or 5 different guys at you and keep rotating in and out and keep fresh. That's exactly what Al Golden is designed to do. So I like our matchup defensively. Mike, looking at the other side of the ball, I think this is the big area where a lot of people just say, oh, it's Lincoln Riley. It must be a bad defense. Not quite the case. They've made a really, really big jump. A year ago, they were number 105th in SP plus defense. And right now they are 36th in defense according to SP plus. Massive improvement. Really from like bottom barrel to bottom third. Where's the big improvement come from?
It's in the passing game. So this was an area they were leaky in a lot of different areas last year. Their defense, generally in the Lincoln Riley era, has been very weak. It's just been the elite offenses that have been carrying the day. So the area though that this defense has really improved in is, as I mentioned, in the passing game, particularly in the explosive passing game. So they're just not giving up big plays in the pass. So in fact, they're 4th in passing explosiveness allowed this year. Like, look, if you're an offense that just lives and dies by hitting the deep ball in the passing game, this is an area where USC excels in. This is an area where they could really shut down your offense. Fortunately for Notre Dame, this is not an area that we've necessarily had to lean on as much this year. It's an area that we've been improving in, certainly, but we've been able to get it done through explosive run plays. We've been able to get it done through just kind of marching downfield with a reasonable success rate. So this is while this is their greatest strength, this is something that I think we can get by with, without really trying to push it. That's the first area I'm focusing on. The other areas is that their tackling is really cleaned up. So not surprising that if you see a team make a jump in their tackling, oftentimes that'll represent kind of an improvement across the board. Just their fundamentals are better. You see that with their tackling rates. They're number fourth in the country in tackling. They've really cleaned up their fundamentals. There aren't as many missed tackles, so they're not blowing they're not blowing their coverage. They're not missing tackles. They essentially, I think they kind of attack the low hanging fruit. These are kind of like the areas that are easiest to clean up in terms of improving your defense. And they're not a great defense, but they're, I would say above average. They're like in SP Plus has them as like I think 35, like in the mid 30s, basically. There's some areas that they do struggle in, and that's, I think, areas that actually match up pretty well for us. So 85th, they're 85th in havoc generated. We're 10th in havoc allowed. So that basically tells you that they shouldn't really be getting a ton of pressure on Riley Leonard. He should generally have a clean pocket for most of the game. We shouldn't be getting tackles for loss. They're probably not generating turnovers. So that helps us. We're not going to get pushed back. We're not going to fall behind schedule. Their leading defensive lineman has just 3 sacks on the year, only 9 interceptions, 3 forced fumbles. So these are all stats that are telling you that this isn't a defense that makes big impact plays. They've made the first step of cleaning up, really, really basic stuff with the fundamentals, but they haven't yet gotten to that next level where they're generating impact plays. In terms of line yards, that was an area that we really exploited against Army. This is the stat that tells you how much push you're allowing the opposing offensive line to get. They're 67th, and ND's topped our offensive line. On the other hand, we're top 30 in that metric. So this is a game where our offensive line should be able to give our running backs some room to run. And we have really good running backs. We saw this against Army. If you give our running backs a lot of room, you're going to probably tend to see a lot of run explosiveness on our end. And that's another area that they're not great in. And that's they're 87th in run explosiveness, whereas we're number 1. So they're much improved, but interestingly, their strengths and weaknesses, I think they seem to match up pretty well with what we do really well on offense. So yes, obviously much better than, the depths that they were in before, but I really like this matchup. I think this is a defense that we should be able to, we should really be able to exploit some of their weaknesses.
I completely agree, and I think it's a good segue to get into score predictions, where the opening Vegas line has Notre Dame as a touchdown favorite, 7-point favorite. SP Plus implies Notre Dame's about a 10 to 11-point favorite, and the ESPN win predictor has Notre Dame winning this one 71% of the time. So we're favored. It's not a 90% slam dunk. It's, a 1-score game, maybe 1.5-score game, depending what metrics you look at. And look, I struggled with this one. The more I read about it, it's a rivalry game. They're much improved on defense. They've kept it close in every game. No one has beaten them by more than 7 points. It's their opportunity to play spoiler. It's a top 15 talented team. And I just love the SP Plus metrics. And the SP Plus metrics says this isn't a 6-5 team. This is a top 25 team in the advanced metrics. And they're just losing a bunch of close games. But I think those mismatches, everywhere I look, it's advantage Notre Dame, where our strengths on offense goes up against their weaknesses on defense. Their strengths on offense, that passing attack with Lincoln Riley, we're number 2 in Pro Football Focus coverage grades. Their ability to go and get big plays or kind of churn out Woody Marks yardage, well, we're number 7 in tackling. So I think everywhere where I look, it's a good matchup for Notre Dame. And most importantly, I got to stick to my guns. At the beginning of the year, I said Notre Dame would not allow 20 points in a game. I said USC was going to be the toughest test, but that Notre Dame would not give up 20 points in a game. And we did just one time this year against Louisville. And let me remind our listeners that our offense and special teams turned the ball over 3 times for 3 Louisville scoring drives that went no more than 23 yards in that game. So 17 points went on the board with really nothing Al Golden could do about it. So with Louisville as an outlier, credit goes to the defense. I'm going to stick to my guns. I don't think Notre Dame gives up 20 points in this one. I've got Notre Dame winning 35-17, a heavy dose of Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, and Riley Leonard. Big day on the ground. Irish win big, move on to 11-1, secure a home field game in the college football playoff. Mike, what's your prediction?
Totally agree. I mentioned how I like the matchups for our offense versus their defense, and then I totally agree with you flipping to the other sides of the ball. I think I think we're going to be able to run the ball on them quite a bit. And then I think if they try to load the box, hypothetically, right? If they try to offset that, one, we have a mobile quarterback, so that makes it a lot harder to do that to begin with. But I also think, as we were talking about in our recap of the Army game, I think our offense is just hitting another level where we're becoming much more balanced. So if they do that, I think Riley Leonard is good enough now to where he can make them pay. And yes, they're good at limiting pass explosiveness, but they give up. I would say that they give up their passing game success rate is actually that's an area that they're not great in. So they do allow a lot of successful plays in the passing game. They just aren't 60-yard bombs downfield. For them, I feel like it's kind of pick your poison with our offense. Like they're gonna have to. It's like, okay, you can shut down the run game, but then Riley Leonard's good enough to do damage. If you don't do anything, then our running game should be able to just run on them all day. And then I'm with you. I think our defense is just operating at such a high level. As good as USC's offenses, and this isn't as good as past USC offenses. It's definitely nowhere near where the Caleb Williams offenses have been. But I think we just have way too much on defense. And yeah, they're good enough to where I think they'll put up some points. But to me, I have us winning 32-18. So I'm with you. I have USC not getting 20 points. I think the Coliseum at times in the past has been a bit of a boogeyman for Notre Dame football, but I don't think that's going to be the case this time. I think when we have a team that's potentially a true college football playoff contender, I think we show up. I think Marcus Freeman has the boys fired up, and I think we're looking into places to stay in South Bend for the first college football playoff home game in South Bend.
So let's get into our last segment. I said earlier we're going to cover whether or not Notre Dame is a true contender, not to make the playoff, but to win it all. And I said that I was going to call this the It's All Anne's Fault segment. So I'm going to explain that in a second. But first we need to start with, how are we defining contender? Because it's subjective. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of narratives like, well, how would we stack up against Ohio State? How do we stack up against Texas or Georgia? Well, a really simple way to think about it is, I think we would all agree if you're in a game and it's a 50-50 toss-up, that makes you a contender. But also, if you're playing 4 playoff games and they're all 50-50, if you keep multiplying those odds against each other, even if you're 50-50 against every team in the playoff, that only gives you a 6% chance to win it all. There's 12 teams. Like, it's still super competitive. There's 12 teams with a shot to win it. Right now, The Athletic gives Notre Dame about an 8% chance to win the whole thing. That's the 5th best odds right now. We are the 5th best odds to win the national championship. Yes, that makes you a contender. Ohio State, 29% chance. Oregon, 20% chance. Like, are they the favorites? For sure. No doubt about it. But I think there's a clear threshold there where, even Penn State, 7% chance, even Miami, 5% chance. After that, everyone's 2% or less. And so right now, I think if you're one of those top 6, 7 teams, like, yes, you get to count yourself as a contender. Maybe not the favorite, but a contender. Another way, though, we wanted to think about this was to put some math behind it and say, what are the odds in these individual games? So, for example, right now, of course, you'd be favored to beat, SMU or Boise State, but are you just going to be a double-digit underdog against Oregon or Ohio State or Texas? And so I'm going to put a little bit of math behind it. That we looked up some information that Phil Steele's published an article on. If you're a 10.5 to 14-point underdog, you win about 20% of the time. If you're a 7.5 to 10-point underdog, you win about 25% of the time. If you're a 3.5 to 7-point underdog, that jumps up to 35% of the time. So you start getting close to, hey, like, you're not the favorite, but you're going to win 1 in 3. Like, you're going to get your shot 3 times out of 10, 4 times out of 10. And in fact, if it's 3 points or less, it really becomes a toss-up where, underdogs of 0.5 to 3 points actually win 48% of the time. So I think once you start getting within a 7-point underdog where you're winning, somewhere between 35 to 50% of the time, I think that's the definition that we're going to use as contenders. Are you a 7-point underdog or less? So, Mike, there's a couple ways I want to look at it. The first one, though, is historically, how often have we been a contender? Um, when we've gotten into the playoff or when we've gotten into the BCS championship game, like when we look back at those seasons, have we ever actually been a contender, or did we just so happen to be playing in the game?
Yeah, I mean, so framing this up, we're gonna say that 7 points or less versus the number one team in the country, as you had pointed out. That gives you an actual shot at winning this game. It's like a third of the time you're actually gonna pull off a win. So if we use that kind of as our reference point here, we can look at SP plus, which is the predictive measure that we focus on to predict points and spreads on a neutral field. So I guess I'm going to start with these seasons where it's just very memorable seasons that we've had in the past, where we were in the playoff or we were in the BCS championship game, because those are seasons that first come to mind where you might think that we were potentially a championship contender. So I'll start with 2012. Maybe it's not so surprising to remind everyone we were 17-point underdogs per SP plus versus Bama. So that would tell you that we were definitively not a contender that year. Of course, there's a chance you could win, but the vast majority of the time, you're not going to. 2018, that's another memorable squad, but we were still 15.5-point underdogs per SP plus versus Bama. So again, this is another scenario where memorable season, very, great Notre Dame team, but not a team that was really going to be able to, not expected to actually win a title that year. 2020 is an interesting example because that's one where we were a little bit closer. So we were actually 7.5-point underdogs per SP plus versus Ohio State. So that's the only time that we were actually close. We were kind of in the vicinity to where you could maybe pull it off. But even then, you're certainly not a favorite. In this case, it's still pretty unlikely. 25% of the time, you would have been able to beat the best team in the country. So bringing this all back, 2012, 2018, more than a 14-point underdog. That's really just a 15% chance or less to pull those upsets, let alone a team in the 14 playoff, needing to win a couple of those games. So very unlikely that one of those teams would have been capable of doing that. We've talked about this before. Some of these seasons, the 2012 season is a great example. It's a season where it was a team of destiny in many ways. We had a lot of very fortunate moments, plays that went our way. I mean, the Pitt game is a great example of that. That's a game that we honestly probably should have lost. The Stanford goal lines, like Stanford, we had a very, very close game that we ended up winning. But there were a lot of moments that were just like every single play that was a critical play that could have swung our season one way or the other tended to go in our favor. So what that means is we had a really good record. We had a really memorable season, but the data doesn't say that we were actually a top contender. So that's how you kind of stumble into a situation where you end up playing a team that you're actually overmatched against. Look, there's always a narrative that Notre Dame tends to choke in big games, or we tend to not show up. Brett and I talk about this point all the time. That's not really the case. We, in some of these we definitely played worse than we would have liked, but many times it's just us playing how the data says that we should have played. We just were overmatched against a much better team, and I think that's exactly what you saw here. I guess I'll now turn it back to you for the answer to your question. So I guess the question is when were we actually a contender?
Yeah, and just before diving into that too, it was just dawning on me too. It's like saying if Boise State or Iowa State are right now projected to get the last bye, if you told me they got blown out by, I don't know, Notre Dame or Georgia in the second round, I don't think that means that they choked just because they were a top four team. I think it means this 12-team playoff is a really funny format, and it puts teams in games where they don't really belong, but it's the format for college football. The 4-team playoff in the BCS did the same thing in a 4-team and 2-team format, and Notre Dame was just in that seat, in several instances. So you go back and look at when we were a contender. Ann's got one older brother, Taylor. He's 9 years older than Ann. And he always says the first 9 years of his life, Notre Dame football was amazing. And since Ann was born in 1992, it's all Ann's fault and we've been terrible. And the data says Taylor is absolutely right. So this is where we go. Shout out, Taylor. This segment's for you in the It's All Ann's Fault segment of when was Notre Dame a contender? And the SP Plus started in 1985. So they've got data going back a while to 1985. We were the number one team in SP Plus in 1989. So obviously that makes you a contender. We were statistically the best team in the country. In 1988, when we won it all, we were number 2 in SP Plus, and we're just 1 point off of Miami from being number 1. And of course, contenders, we won the title. In 1992, in one of, just some of the greatest college football ever, I think 93 was game of the century, but in 1992, we were also number 2 in SP Plus, and we're just 2 points off in the metric from Florida State. So clearly, in that era, through the Holtz era into 92, we were right there with the best of the best. But in the last 32 trips around the sun, ladies and gentlemen, this is the closest we've ever been to the top of the sport. This is the closest we've ever been in SP Plus to the number 1 team in the country. Right now, we are 6.5 points off of Ohio State. So if we played Ohio State on a neutral field tomorrow, SP Plus suggests we should be 6.5 point underdogs. That is the closest we've been since 1992. Now, you still need to step back and acknowledge you're only beating Ohio State 35% of the time. Like, you're still an underdog, but you're contending if you're in that moment. And I think importantly, Ohio State started to break away from the pack in SP Plus. Everyone else that's currently at the top, Oregon, Texas, and Georgia, are all just above us in the SP Plus and in one of these top 12 seeds. For example, Bama also is. I'm throwing them out. They choked against Oklahoma. Oregon, Texas, and Georgia would all be about 0.5 to 2 point favorites against Notre Dame, a virtual toss-up. Miami, Tennessee, Penn State, Indiana would all be about 1 to 4 point underdogs versus Notre Dame, so also roughly toss-ups. And we would be over 7 point favorites against, take your pick of the litter, SMU, BYU, Boise State, Colorado, Clemson. I can go down the list, where against kind of the other half of the teams that might get into the playoff, we would be about, 75% or higher win expectancy. In fact, we'd be more likely to win those games than we would, say, against USC this weekend. And so where that goes is, yeah, we're absolutely contenders. There's one team in the field where we'd have a 1-3 shot. Everyone else is a toss-up, or we'd be the heavy favorite. And, I think that's just one lens. I think it's, one way to look at it. Of course, there's narratives. Of course, like, you've got to go and prove it out. Of course, like, we've got to show up and play the games. But statistically, we are right there in the top 12 of this playoff field. And we haven't been before. Like we talked about, you mentioned in 2020, we were 7.5 point underdogs in the gap versus the number 1 team that year is at Ohio State in that metric. That was the next closest we've been. We've had other years where it was, between 7 and 11 points. They were all in like the pre-1995 era, except for 2015 and 2020. And 2015 was the year of the one, lost by 2 points to Stanford on the road to close out the year. 2, lost on the failed 2-point conversion attempt in the Hurricane game at Clemson. So that was clearly a very competitive Notre Dame squad that came up 2 plays short of being undefeated in 2015. That is as close as we've been since the early 90s. And really only twice have we even been around the level we're talking about. But this is like for sure right there, especially when you look at not just that number 1 team, but, we're a coin flip with everyone else in the field.
Absolutely. I think right now it's 2 through 9 are just right. They're all right on top of each other. So, hypothetically, if we have a really good game against USC and some of the other teams look a little shaky, it wouldn't be shocking to see us move up like a few more spots. Now, the big thing right now is Ohio State. They're kind of in a bit of a league of their own. They're kind of on their own tier. They're number 1, and then there's a gap kind of to everyone else. But I think with this format, I think just being in the mix of teams that's competitive, teams that could actually win the championship, that is exactly where you want to be in a year that's already had quite a bit of chaos. So, look, I think Ohio State, they're clearly, I think they're the best team. Obviously, they dropped the game to Oregon, but I think that that's the team that I would want to face the least in a hypothetical playoff matchup. But I think just given that you got to win multiple rounds, weird stuff could happen. Ohio State they could easily drop a game to one of these teams. And then you just making it and being competitive enough to beat any of these teams, you put yourself in a position to see what happens, right? Like we could be the beneficiary of some chaos in the playoff. So I think if you're, a lifelong Notre Dame fan and it's been a bit slim picking since the 80s, this is a sign that the team is built a little bit differently top to bottom. This isn't a fluky season. this isn't a year where we've kind of stumbled our way into a contender status. And again, contender, not a favorite, but just being able to, like if you have a particularly good day against the number one team in the country, not crazy that you beat them, wouldn't be that shocking. And I think that's where we're at, and that's as you mentioned, as you went through all this data, that's a place that we haven't been in a very long time.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting for all college football to just have 8 or 9 teams right in that bucket. We haven't had in a while. And I think there's an interesting debate to be had that I think is really hard to put data behind. I do truly think it's kind of well, what do you think? Where is this? Look, Nick Saban's retired, Urban Meyer's retired. Like, is there just a more parity because the two giants of the sport over really the last 15 years are both out of the sport? Is it no? It really is still Georgia, and let's be clear, like Georgia was 13-1 last year and got left out of the playoff for losing by 3 to Alabama in the SEC championship game, and then we said they're not one of the 4 best teams. Like, come on. And so, is this just a rebuilding year for Kirby Smart? Or is this the new norm because of NIL and the transfer portal? It's, Notre Dame's ability to go get Riley Leonard to upgrade a team. It's Ohio State's ability to reload right away with Caleb Downs at safety and Will Howard at quarterback. Is it like, are we going to just see more and more of this? Oregon with Dylan Gabriel having a potential Heisman Trophy winner. Like, all of these teams are able to reload so much more quickly, but also the team at the top, Kirby Smart can't keep all of his backups because, sure, they might be his future stars next year, but if they're not playing this year, they want to go elsewhere. So that actually, does that lead to a talent drain on that number one team that just has too much talent to actually get on the field? And it's leading to more parity? Maybe. Like, I think all of those arguments could be true where, no, we just have a, couple year transition period until the next dominant, Florida State of the 90s, Bama's of the last decade, the Tim Tebow era Florida teams. Like, we're just waiting on that next phase of a dominant dynasty. Or, I don't know, we're in a different world with NIL and transfers. But right now, I think the convergence of that for the first year with this 12-team playoff, what a perfect recipe where we can sit and debate, do conference championship games matter anymore? These buys are so stupid. Would you actually rather be number 5 or number 6 than number 4? Like, I think there's all of these debates around college football, and it's going to come out because you're going to have some really funky matchups where some of the best teams are disadvantaged to, say, Iowa State just kind of falling into a bye if they win the Big 12. And I think all of these things are really fun narratives for fans, and they're especially made more fun with so much parity in the sport. Notre Dame is one example of that, but I think you could say that about a bunch of other teams right now where it's also their first time being at the upper echelon of the sport. Take Oregon in a very long time. And I think that's going to make for a really, really fun December and January for college football fans.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we're just timing. It just seems like hopefully we're just timing all the confluence of all these factors at the perfect time. Marcus Freeman's hitting his stride as a coach. Our team is more talented and more deep than it's been in a long time. You have a greater amount of parity due to all these factors that you were mentioning, and you have this format that also just tends to invite more chaos and tends to allow many different possibilities happen. So you have all this happening, and look, again, as I keep saying, doesn't make you a favorite, but it means you actually do have a real shot. And I think that adds an extra level of excitement going into the postseason.
11 down, 1 to go. Happy Thanksgiving to Irish Nation. Hope it's a restful and joyous holiday break. And until we talk again, Irish beat Trojans.
Irish beat Trojans.